This series of videos introduces the 38 chapters of the Routledge Handbook of Environmental Movements. It's a project of the Social Change Lab, and we gratefully acknowledge the support of the Mary Lee bequest for the work of our team.
We are going to talk about our chapter for the Routledge Handbook on Environmental Movements. We wrote chapter 18 on environmental movements and their political context. My name is Joost de Moor. I'm an assistant professor at Sciences Po in Paris, and I've been doing research on environmental and in particular climate movements for about the past 10 years, focusing on, among other things, how political context shape that kind of activism.
And I'm Matthias Wallström. I'm associate professor in sociology at the University of Gothenburg, and I've also been doing research on the climate movement for roughly the past 10 years, but also in some other areas like repression and individual mobilization in other movements. But what we're going to talk about today, that is the political opportunity structure, which is the concept that we'll focus on, is also something that has interested me on and off for quite some time.
Yeah, political opportunity structure indeed. When talking about how social movements are affected by their political context, we can think of several things, but political opportunity structure has definitely been the main context in the literature. And so in our chapter, we decided to focus on that concept and on research building on that particular concept. So what we did in our chapter and what we'll do as well in our talk is first of all to clarify a bit what that actually is, a political opportunity structure. So what does that concept mean, and what are the elements that one can look at when studying a political opportunity structure? And very importantly as well, how political opportunity structures affect social movements, which is not something obvious. It pertains to fundamental questions in social sciences regarding to the question of structure and agency. How are people acting in society affected by the way society is structured, and in this case, social and environmental movements in particular. And we'll argue that looking at that is particularly important because the straightforward way of looking at political opportunity structures as if they affect activism in a more or less direct way typically doesn't really work. There's too many contradictory findings to just look at it in that really direct and simple way. So we need to look at what happens in between, at the mechanisms of how those structures affect the activism. And one of the three arguments that we'll be making in this presentation, in this chapter, is that we need to look at, in particular, at narratives, at the stories that movements tell about the context in which they act, and how that helps them to make sense of that context and to respond to it. We'll also talk a bit more about how this concept of political opportunity structures has then been used in the literature on environmental movements. It's been used there actually quite extensively, and to some extent even originates from that corner of social movement studies. And in that, we'll make a second argument, namely that research has focused in particular on input structures, namely the question, how open are states or governments to the efforts of social movements to make demands to influence them. Whereas the second element, the output structures, namely what can states get done, how effective are they in, for instance, turning the demands of social movements into actual effective policy outcomes, how does that shape movements? That's we argue, at least equally important question, but one that has remained largely overlooked. And then finally, we will be looking also a bit at our own research into climate activism, research that we've been doing together over the past couple of years. In that research, we'll make those two first arguments a bit more tangible. So the argument about the narratives and the argument about input and output structures, but we'll also make a third argument, and that is the argument that to what extent political opportunity structures actually matter depends a bit on how instrumental the orientation of a social movement is. And we'll argue that the most recent mobilizations in the climate movement might suggest that the orientation is becoming more moralistic than instrumental, and that as a result, for them, political opportunity structures become less important. But before getting into too much details, it's probably useful to clarify a bit what a political opportunity structure actually is, what it consists of, and how it might affect social movements.
Yes, and in order to understand this concept correctly, I think it's a point of would be a point in kind of taking a step back and thinking about, okay, so how do we actually think about mobilizations? What triggers people? When do people mobilize and when do they not mobilize? How come certain mobilizations look a certain way? How come some mobilizations are more successful than others in terms of various types of political policy outcomes or other types of outcomes? And so these are obviously essential questions that social movement researchers and researchers, obviously then also on the environmental movements, have focused on for a very long time. But the way people have been thinking about them has also varied. And we'll not delve into the history of social movement research for too long, but I think one perspective, which is kind of a common sense perspective, which I think is useful to use as kind of a backdrop or contrast to the notion of political opportunities, is what is usually called the grievance approach, that you understand mobilizations in terms of what people are dissatisfied with and the level of dissatisfaction or the level of problems in society. So the common sense notion would be that the more environmental problems we get, the stronger the environmental movement will be, and the more concerned people will become, and then people will become mobilized and protest, and perhaps also become successful. Or that would supposedly also apply to other areas like the women's movement, or for that matter, let's say far-right movements that would react then to, let's say, more immigrants would lead to more far-right violence. That's another area which I'm doing research in, so that's why I take that example. But what many scholars in social movements realized around the maybe earlier as well, but partly during the 1970s, is that, well, actually, there are a lot of situations where the grievances are very severe, that people are really concerned about a lot of things, where people are, really repressed. Women has been repressed during history. How come we didn't have a women's movement in earlier times, and so on? So in order to explain the kind of mismatch between the level of grievances and the level of mobilization and the character of mobilization, social movement scholars have suggested different other explanatory factors. And one of those factors is to look at the political context and say that, well, actually, what movements do is that they tend to mobilize when they have political opportunities to do so, or when they have the opportunities to make a difference. So if things are totally hopeless, there will be no mobilization, or the mobilization will at least not perhaps be very broad, and it will perhaps not so likely be successful. But when there are things like political allies or absence of repression or ways of communicating your grievances to the policy, etc., then that will facilitate mobilization. And that concept is kind of captured by this notion of political opportunity structure, which then is I would even say infamous, because it's been operationalized or defined in quite a number of different ways. Quite a large number of different factors has been, put into this notion. But broadly speaking, it kind of captures the notion that there are more or less stable factors outside of the social movement, which affects the opportunities for mobilization or opportunities for a successful mobilization, and that affects level of mobilization, character, and outcomes.
So it's maybe good to, at this point, I mean, you've mentioned already, it's one out of many explanations. It's one of the main tools in the social movement scholars' toolbox, but it's not necessarily a competing argument, right? It's the grievance still needs to be there. It's not because there is an open opportunity that activists suddenly start to come up with all kinds of issues that they might use. And by the same token, one of the other main explanations that the handbook also covers in other chapters is a question of resources, right? You need resources to make use of these opportunities. And sometimes the opportunity structure doesn't seem to matter at all. There is quite a number of studies in our field that show that people mobilize precisely at the moment when opportunities seem to close down. So it's sometimes a useful tool to make sense of what is happening, and it can be part of a broader set of explanations, but it is not in itself typically the explanation for why we see people take to the streets or engage in other kinds of activism.
Yeah, exactly. And another thing, just to mention that grievances also need to be understood in a way that makes it possible to mobilize on them. So and that's what's typically called the framing approach. Or sometimes people use other concepts to discuss that, and that's also discussed in this same volume. That you kind of need to package your claim in a way which is convincing for others that would mobilize them, and people should ideally realize that an issue is important and urgent and possible to change, etc. And I think also before we get into I mean, this you will return to this, I believe, but that this notion has also been criticized and discussed back and forth. And I think personally, it's most usefully understood as something that what the sociologist Herbert Blumer called a sensitizing concept. So it's basically a concept that can be a little bit vague, where there is not necessarily always a straightforward causal effect or whatever, but it kind of tells you a direction where to look for important factors that can explain a mobilization. And I think, that there are obviously various types of distinctions that you can make here. I think we also note in our chapter that there are other suggestions or other types of opportunity structures have been theorized as well. People speak sometimes of discursive opportunities, legal opportunities, cultural opportunities, corporate opportunities when it comes to movements that primarily direct themselves towards private businesses. But what we discuss here are factors that relate primarily to governmental institutions on different levels in society. So on the international level, on the national level, or even like you can also speak of local or regional or municipal political opportunity structures that would create different conditions for mobilization on different levels. I think another, I mean, obviously the question, and I partly answered it already, or when I talked about the mechanism here. Okay, so we have a context, and I kind of implied that the idea is that movements are rational actors, that they want to accomplish something. The leadership, the supposed leadership perhaps within a movement, wants to accomplish something, mobilize people, and they kind of do so when there are opportunities for it. But it is a little bit of an open question, and people have been discussing why, you know, or how this effect comes about, and that's one of the topics that we also address in our chapter. That, and basically, very roughly, we split, we distinguish between two different ideas about this. And one idea is basically that, okay, so you have this context, and you have a lot of different movements that constantly try to mobilize and affect the state. And then when the opportunities are beneficial for some types of mobilizations, then they will succeed, and you will see them, and then you can conclude that, okay, so you have beneficial contextual factors here, and then you will see mobilization. But that's also, I suppose that there are contexts where that could apply, but we argue that the main explanation, right, would be the perception hypothesis, that movements or actors within the movement make some kind of interpretation of what their opportunities are, and then they decide to act upon that. And but that could obviously create a little bit, let's say, overly rational perspective on movements, that you have this kind of strong leadership, they perceive their environment, and then they decide rationally what to do and tell others to do that. But movements are much more nebulous and complicated organisms, so to speak, so it doesn't really work that way, we argue, and we will return to that, I suppose, where we will kind of emphasize how the perception of political opportunities is a matter of trial and error, and about what stories are told within the movement about how the relationship to governmental institutions work.
Yeah, so this idea of the perception, it's quite intuitive, but of course it also opens a can of worms in terms of questions about, well, surely some actors are going to disagree with each other about whether something was an opportunity or a threat, or whether someone is misreading the context in which they are acting. But at some level, if, as we will discuss, some sort of macro level studies look at how the objectively real political opportunity structures do correlate with certain strategies, then somehow people do need at some level to agree with each other on that opportunity structure for those broader trends to emerge, right? If everyone would constantly disagree with each other, then that correspondence wouldn't really be very likely to emerge. There is another sort of related question about whether there is a wrongly perceived opportunity, or whether every opportunity is relative. So I think an important question for anyone working with the concept of political opportunity structures is to ask the question: an opportunity for whom and for what? I think it's always relative. I think if some actor says that there is an opportunity in their political context, it's probably not very productive to say that they are right or wrong about that. It probably says something about that political context relative to how they think about goals and strategies. And that creates then that diversity within a single opportunity structure, which we'll touch upon a bit more later on as well.
And I think it might be worth adding here that in order to position ourselves a little bit here also in relation to different strands within social movement research, and that is that this kind of political opportunity tradition has typically been associated with, let's say, the more quantitative tradition focusing on, let's say, objective characteristics of the context. And whereas it has also been criticized by some of the more qualitative, more interpretative, more constructivist traditions or parts of social movement research. But I think where I believe we both position ourselves is kind of in between these two traditions, saying that, well, actually these objective factors, they do matter, but they also need to be interpreted, and you have to take that interpretation and the storytelling about that interpretation into account.
Yeah. Perhaps we've been talking about political opportunity structures in quite general terms now. Many of the people watching this video will probably have ended up here because they're particularly interested in environmental movements. That's why they probably heard about the Routledge Handbook on Environmental Movements. So to make things perhaps a bit more concrete, let's talk also a bit about how this concept has been applied specifically to the question of environmental movements. And when we looked at this, when we made this inventory of all the research that, or at least a large part of the research that applies political opportunity structures to environmental movements, we pretty immediately saw that actually many of the classics in the field of political opportunity structure literature in general relied quite heavily on research into environmental movements. So many of the things that we've already been talking about actually come from people doing research on environmental movements. But we'll talk about that now in a bit more detail. And a good place to start, an obvious place to start, is an article by Herbert Kitschelt from 1986. It's probably one of the most cited publications in social movement studies in general, I would dare to say. I hope I'm not saying this wrong. I believe it was published in the British Journal of Political Science. So showing also that this is a concept that it's more used on the political science side of social movement studies than on the sociology side of social movement studies. Herbert Kitschelt looked at the anti-nuclear movement in 4 countries, in France, Sweden, Germany, and the US. And he categorized these 4 countries based on their political opportunity structures, roughly in 4, along 2 dimensions that create kind of 4 spaces in a 2x2 diagram. So on the one hand, and this is where we come to what I mentioned in the introduction, namely the distinction between input structures and output structures. So on the one hand, Herbert Kitschelt categorized these 4 countries on the basis of their input structures, distinguishing between open input structures and closed input structures, where open input structures are countries where it's relatively easy as a political outsider, as a citizen, individually or collectively, to get your message across to political institutions. So there's many institutional avenues, let's say referenda, ombudsman, official contact points, where you can make your claims, your grievances heard to the political system. That would be a relatively open system. And by the same token, a relatively closed system then would be a system where there is none such channels, where perhaps the state has a tradition of simply doing what it thinks is best and not really having a very well-established tradition or institutions for citizens to participate in that decision-making process. So it's more exclusionary. So Kitchell divides the 4 countries that I mentioned before as follows. He argues that the US and Sweden resemble open political opportunity structures, and Germany and especially France represent traditionally closed political opportunity structures. So that's the first dimension. Then on the second dimension, he continues to organize these countries along the output structure. So he says some countries are very efficient in getting things done. For instance, there is few veto players. The government, when it wants to do something, it can fairly easily just roll out a policy without having to consult other actors, without there being more institutional barriers to stop it from doing that. So it's a really efficient state. So that would be a strong output structure. A weak output structure would, of course, be the opposite of that. So he divides the countries, the 4 countries, as follows. Sweden and France resemble strong output structures, and the US and Germany resemble weak output structures. So this, in a nutshell, is the most basic way of applying the political opportunity structure approach, or at least this is, let's say, the independent variable of the equation. And next, what many social movement scholars do then next is to try and explain in particular what kind of strategies social movements use to get things done in those particular contexts. So the first thing is regarding the input structure. Here, the most obvious and the pattern that Kitchell also claims to have observed is that social movements operating in an open input structure will make use of the opportunities that they have in front of them, and they will, as a result, use assimilative strategies, as he calls them. If there's an opportunity for a referendum, social movements will grasp that opportunity. By contrast, if there is a closed political opportunity structure, social movements don't really have a choice other than to say, well, if you're not going to be willing to listen to us, we'll just start making a lot of noise in the streets. We'll turn to more radical measures to still get our message across. And that, Kitchell argues, is then also what happened in Germany and France, where the anti-nuclear movement ended up being much more radical, using much more disruptive strategies than their counterparts in the US and Sweden. And then with regards to the strong opportunity structures, and here I'll focus mainly on Sweden and the US, Kitchell says, well, in the US, where there was a weak opportunity structure, even in the implementation of policies, anti-nuclear movements continue to try and influence that the decision-making process also on the outside, on the output side of things. By contrast, in Sweden, the output structure was quite well organized, quite a closed process, and so there were few opportunities for social movements to have an influence at that point. But what did happen is that in Sweden, so the anti-nuclear movements were able to have quite easy access at the input side, and then at the output side, there was a strong rollout of the resulting policies, leading to the greatest substantive success for the movement in this country. So again, Kitchell's model is sort of the archetype of approaching this. It's quite positivistic, it's very structuralist, it's very rationalistic and straightforward. And it also received quite a bit of critique. And I think it's a good 0.0 for us to talk more about sort of the alternative approaches, the questions that emerge from that. And so already a couple of years after Kitchell's article in 1986, Dieter Rucht, another big name in social movement studies in 1990, published another article, which was kind of a response to Kitchell's article, which said, well, actually that model that Kitchell gave us is overly simplistic, and actually it overlooks a lot of the variations within the countries and between the countries. It's too crude and it's too simplistic. In principle, Rucht wasn't necessarily opposed to the basic idea that Kitschelt was putting forward, but he argued it's too one-sided, essentially. And so we argued that this basic idea of input structures and output structures needs to be understood in a much broader set of explanatory variables, as we actually also already mentioned before. So a couple of things that Rucht mentions that need to be taken into account to make sense of why social movements do what they do is, for instance, the transnational diffusion of strategies. Sometimes movements simply do what they see other movements do in other countries. A recent good example of that is probably the international rollout of Extinction Rebellion, a movement that started very clearly in the UK and then got mirrored in France, in Sweden, in the Netherlands, in Germany, in many, if not all countries in Europe and furthermore across the world. Rucht also points to the fact that we need to take into account cultural explanations. There is traditions, there is repertoires, there is simply culturally informed preferences in populations about how politics should be done, and not all of this can be put down to a simple structural argument. Rucht also points to the fact that opportunities are not just something that you can compare between countries. He says there is also changes over time. We cannot just, so Kitschelt's model is quite static. It says there is these 4 types of political opportunity structures, and we can compare between them. Rucht makes things a bit more complicated when he says, yes, but these things also change over time. And possibly it's especially when an opportunity changes over time, when something opens up or closes down, that a social movement is affected by it. And that perhaps makes also sense. It's perhaps more difficult to imagine that a social movement would go and sit down and say, well, let's look at our opportunity structure relative to that of Switzerland. Let's base our strategic decisions on that. So Rucht adds a couple of these nuances to the model of Kitschelt without necessarily wanting to undermine it. So again, this basic idea of political opportunity structures is a tool that we have in our toolbox, but it needs to be used in relation to other tools that we have. A study that looking at least from this point of view, is quite similar to Kitschelt's one, and that is worth briefly mentioning here without going into too much details, is the study by Hans-Peter Krisi and his colleagues from 1995, titled The New Social Movements in Western Europe. This is probably, I would dare to put some money on it that it's the most cited book in social movement studies, or close to it. It's probably in the, I would definitely say it's in the top 5, so it's worth mentioning here. And it's a book that also draws on multiple explanatory models, but definitely also the political opportunity structure. It looks at multiple cases, not just the environmental movement, but one example of an environmental movement that it looks at is the mobilizations after the Chernobyl nuclear disaster in 1986, where various anti-nuclear mobilizations occurred. And here, the study is quite similar to that of Kitschelt. It uses a couple of different countries. It also has France and Germany, but it adds, rather than Sweden and the US, Switzerland and the Netherlands. And here, one of the most basic comparisons that are made based on the political opportunity structure theory is that in France, there is a closed opportunity structure. So the French movements are known for their radical tactics, for their quite militant ways of protesting. And the authors say, well, that has everything to do with the fact that there is simply not very much opportunities for those movements to do it otherwise. But in strong contrast, the Netherlands, and in particular Switzerland, Switzerland is world famous for its referendum culture. And so if you want to get something done, you organize a referendum. You don't have to go to the streets or even go organize, let protests escalate into riots. It's very rare for that to happen in Switzerland. And the authors say, well, that has everything to do with the amount of institutional opportunities available to activists. So these are some very basic ways of thinking about political opportunity structures, but they're definitely not uncontested. So one good example here to mention is Chris Root's edited volume, Environmental Protest in Europe from 2003. where a collection of well-known social movement scholars look at how environmental protest, what it looks like in different European countries. And by putting these case studies together, the authors raise the question whether indeed the patterns that they find resemble the patterns that the political opportunity structures would predict. And the conclusion actually of the authors is, and I'll quote here, that strictly structural factors, political institutional arrangements foremost among them, explain little if any of the variation in the patterns of environmental protests among the 7 states we have considered. It is the contingent and conjunctural dimensions of political opportunities rather than the truly structural ones that best explain the patterns that we have observed. So we see here some contestation about whether that model introduced by Kitschelt and then used by Creasy and colleagues really is so helpful in making sense of protest. Another contestation, and because this basic model has been contested over and over again in the social movement studies, but one that is interesting here because it also focuses in particular on environmental movements, is an article by Claire Saunders from 2009, who raises a pretty basic objection to the standard political opportunity structure approach when she says that, well, how is it possible that if an opportunity structure determines what protest looks like, that within a single political opportunity structure, we see such a big variety of protest tactics emerge. In every country, even in Switzerland and even in France, in these archetypical countries, we see both institutional and more radical groups operating. So how can we make sense of that? So she says, well, the explanation here falls short. We need to again take into account other variables, but she doesn't go as far as to say that political opportunity structures don't matter. In her particular study of the UK, of environmental activists in the UK, she argues actually that the effect is as follows, namely the groups that are more excluded by the political opportunity structures, the type of groups that maybe have a more radical demand that is not taken into account by decision makers, they tend to be more coordinated. They tend to collaborate more in order to deal with the adverse situation that they operate under. And by contrast, the groups that are included, she says, those are found to be much more disintegrated and to operate in a much more isolated manner. So again, many people look at this. Some people take a more straightforward approach, especially the ones operating in the beginning. And then over time, we see people adding more and more nuances. For some people, it's a reason to reject the model entirely, but in most cases, it's rather people saying, well, yes, the context matters, but it's more subtle than the way in which, for instance, Herbert Kitschelt proposed it works back in the day in 1986.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, we can't summarize all the various studies that we cite and summarize in our chapter, and I think those, let's say the early ones and the criticism there very much kind of captures many of the dilemmas that you can find here, and also the kinds of results that tend to come out of these contextual various forms of studies. But just to emphasize again that the concept of political opportunities has been used to, I mean, both in rather different types of studies. So let's say you focused much now on like national comparative studies. Okay, so you have different countries at the same time with similar movements, but then affecting them in different ways, creating different types of mobilizations. But you can also find studies that focus on political opportunities over time and look at how the SAVE movement or the equivalent movements over time have changed depending on changes or openings and closures or however you want to conceptualize that in political opportunities.
But perhaps maybe here one of the most important changes over time that affects almost all environmental movements, and that has particularly shaped the climate movement in over the past few decades, is the increasing emergence of the transnational level of decision making as a political arena, and the political opportunity structures that brings with it. So especially since the Rio conference in 1992, there has been an emerging global policy arena for regarding environmental policy making. That, of course, as a result, then also becomes an interesting space for environmental movements to try and get things done. And so that raises the issue of what some people have called the international political opportunity structure. So particularly Van der Heijden in 2006 basically applies the Kitschelt and Kresi model to the international political opportunity structure, arguing again, we can organize different institutions like the UN and the WTO according to that input-output structure schedule. And here, I think one interesting change we see occurring when this international arena presents itself, and that is that it becomes clear that the question of output structures is actually more important than has been granted regarding it, the amount of attention that it has received over the years. So most research has focused on that input question, which states are open and which ones are closed, and much less attention has gone out to the question of which institutions actually can get something done. And especially in the context of the UN climate process, which of course we are now going to have COP27 this year. So for 27 years, it has had annual and ongoing attempts to do something about climate change. And as we all know, we are very far removed from a sufficient response. So over time, that main institution, the UNFCCC, that has been the main target at the transnational level for environmental and for climate movements in particular, the question regarding that opportunity structure, if you want, has mainly been, is it actually strong enough? Can it get something done? And over time, the answer for more and more environmental and for more and more climate organizations has become no, it's not strong enough. It is actually fundamentally incapable of getting something done about climate change. And so it's too weak, and therefore we shouldn't take it as a target of our actions. With that, perhaps we are actually slowly turning to the research that we've been doing ourselves on this topic, and we won't probably go into too much detail here to also keep an eye on time. And also referring to the chapter itself, where of course we are able to discuss all of these things in much more detail, where you will find some quotes from our research, some of the actual data that leads to all of these conclusions, as well as references to articles where we've developed these arguments in even more detail. But long story short, this idea that the output structures are what really matters in the international political opportunity structure for climate movements, as well as the argument that we made earlier that narratives are really important here, comes from the research that we did around COP21 climate summit in Paris in 2015. That summit was and still is probably the highest profile climate summit that we've ever seen, rivaled perhaps by the Copenhagen climate summit that preceded it, and that also largely shaped the Paris mobilization. So when we started to do research on this mobilization, there were two things that stood out in when we were observing strategic meetings of these movements. The first one was that they were constantly talking about weekends, and the second one was that they were constantly talking about Copenhagen. And they were not talking about a city trip to Copenhagen. They were talking about what weekend they should organize their main mobilization in. And that decision, even though it sounds quite trivial, went actually to the heart of that mobilization and was largely informed by the Copenhagen narrative, as we started to call it. So Copenhagen was 2009, 6 years earlier. It was the climate summit where essentially global leaders had to find a replacement for the Kyoto Protocol, which had guided international climate politics until then, but that was running out as an agreement. And so there was an argument that there was a need for political leaders to find a replacement for that protocol. And so the expectations were very high for Copenhagen. It was largely presented both inside and outside the movement as the last chance to save the planet. So the stakes were very high, as well as media attention, and also in turn the mobilization by the climate movement that mobilized in greater numbers than it ever had until then, but also found actually a great disappointment in the Copenhagen summit when it failed precisely to deliver any binding or otherwise meaningful outcomes towards the mitigation agenda of the UNFCCC. So this was by many experienced as quite a traumatic event and interpreted as the main explanation for why after the summit, the climate movement, which had been peaking up until the Copenhagen summit, largely demobilized. But what we also found was actually that there was a lot of storytelling involved here. So this, what I've been telling you just now, is sort of the boiled down, streamlined version of the Copenhagen narrative. But we also found that actually quite a few people disagreed with that. Some people said, well, actually, we never had great expectations for the Copenhagen summit. Others said, well, we actually didn't fail so much. We actually managed to put the climate topic right on the agenda. And we, groups like Avaz in particular, said, well, actually, we saw our membership numbers go up after Copenhagen. So I don't know what these people are talking about when they say that there was a demobilization after the Copenhagen summit. And it's precisely, on the one hand, this story of the Copenhagen narrative that helped some actors to come together and to say, well, let's mobilize for Paris in a way that draws lessons from Copenhagen, that does it in a very different way, in particular by saying, we are not going to try to influence this process because we've now learned that this process is not capable of delivering meaningful outcomes. Instead, we will just try to make use of the summit and of the momentum that it generates to get our own, to work on our own agenda, to target actors like fossil fuel companies or banks that we think are the real power holders, or to promote alternative grassroots alternatives that are the real solutions to this problem. So these people wanted to mobilize at the end, at the second weekend. And so here I come back to the weekends. They wanted to mobilize it mainly during the second weekend of the COP summit, at the end of the summit, to symbolize that they were not trying to influence the process, rather they were judging it and they were condemning it for its inefficacy. Right? If you want to influence it, you mobilize at the beginning when decisions are still being made. So by mobilizing at the end, they symbolize that was not their plan. By contrast, those groups who contested that Copenhagen narrative and who said, well, the Copenhagen summit was actually not such a failure, and it does still make sense to try to influence the outcome of this policy process. They mobilized at the beginning, or they plan to mobilize at the beginning of the summit to get their message across to the political leaders. And so we see here two competing ideas about the political opportunity structure, focused especially on the output question. Can the UNFCCC actually get things done? And leading to contestations, showing that there is never one single objective interpretation of a political opportunity structure, and leading to actually quite substantial outcomes in terms of strategy and mobilization and conflicts within the movement. Ultimately, things panned out completely different than people had expected, because just 1 week before the beginning of the COP21 climate summit, there were severe terrorist attacks in Paris, and so the French state installed a state of emergency, which, among other things, put a ban on protesting. Many protests did go ahead, but in completely different ways from the original planned ones. So all these strategic discussions didn't directly lead to actions, but that is something that you can read more about in our chapter. So this is a clear case where we argue, well, at least when we take into account this narrative structure, it makes sense to talk about political opportunity structures in this case. But perhaps there is reason to argue that over time, and looking at more recent mobilizations, in particular by Extinction Rebellion and Fridays for Future, maybe the political opportunity structure isn't having such a big impact anymore.
Yeah, I mean, so just to recapitulate there, that okay, so the idea then that you just said was that okay, so well, one of the main ideas here is that movements try some things, protest actions, ways of influencing the state, and then they look at it. Did it succeed? Did it not? Why did it succeed? And then conclusions of a lot of things, but among those of the political opportunities are then drawn, and then movements are imagined to be then to some extent, and I think it's reasonable to think so, rational strategic actors that try to do it in a better way next time. And but the question is then, okay, so what happened after Paris then? And I think one of the main kind of waves of climate protests that we are still partly in, even though it was interrupted by the COVID pandemic, was the one that emerged in the late 2018 and especially during 2019, when groups like Fridays for Future and Extinction Rebellion emerged. And what was particular about those were, I mean, we say a lot of things about those, and they are not the same, and they also vary across different countries. But one thing was that climate protests had so far been rather reactive, in the sense that the international protest was often in connection with various types of meetings, especially these UN COP meetings. So this was kind of a little bit of a new thing when protests internationally, even globally coordinated protests, were mobilized purely on the initiative of the movement. But what was also kind of interesting here, and which we also expand on in the chapter, was that even though these protests were international and even global or globally coordinated, they now started to target to a much larger extent the nation state level. So having then moving from focusing very much, or partly, maybe not exclusively, but having really the emphasis on the international level,
as well as companies and alternative and lifestyles, I think, because that was maybe something to mention here. One of the outcomes after the COP21 was let's not focus on governments anymore, because they are not going to solve this problem for us. Let's take matters into our own hands and let's do it ourselves. Let's shut down the mining companies ourselves. Let's just go in there, sit on the diggers, make sure that they cannot move, and let's promote those alternative lifestyles, the ones that we think are the real solutions ourselves. So let's take matters into our own hands. And then we get what you're talking about now, making clear demands from states again.
Yeah, and obviously shifting level can partly be explained, or could be perhaps be explained as kind of this kind of rational political opportunity structure thinking, because what happened in the Paris Agreement was that the power over the climate policies was to a very large extent pushed down to the nation state level. So no binding agreements, strongly binding agreements were made on the international level, but you know, the whole thing was pushed down to the nations to decide. But on the other hand, when you ask people who protest in, for example, the XR and especially the Fridays for Future protests, about what they think of their government capacity to do anything about the climate issue, and we actually did, because we were part of a large survey project where we handed out surveys to participants in these protests. So when you ask people, they don't have, you know, a very strong faith in the government in actually being able to effect very strong changes. And also when you compare different countries, there's no one-to-one correspondence between the countries that are actually quite good at changing their policies towards a more climate-friendly direction and the degree to which protesters have faith in these governments. So people in Hungary, for instance, in Fridays for Future protests, tended to have more faith in their government for some reason than people in Germany, and that doesn't correspond to the climate policies of those two countries. So that doesn't seem really quite right. So we have in chapter, we have two hypotheses about what this shift towards the national level could mean. And one hypothesis is that actually the movement thinks that it might be able to really affect the political opportunity structure of the state, even though it's not very beneficial right now. It can be changed, and that's especially, we argue, concerning the output structure. So even though the states are currently weak, they can become stronger, because states can, by changing their own laws, put themselves in a stronger, let's say, output position. And the other hypothesis or argument that we make is that we point to the strong prevalence also of very moral motives for participating, that people also say that, well, actually, I'm primarily here because that's the only thing I can do. Even though I don't think it really matters, it's the right thing to do. It's my moral obligation to protest. And that also brings in the complexity of not only environmental mobilizations, but also other mobilizations, that people are not only driven by instrumental motives, that is, like what protest works in terms of outcomes, but also of other types of motives that are less obviously linked to the opportunity structure. So if you are primarily driven by moral motives, you have as strong motivation to protest in a very, let's say, unfriendly, closed context as you have in a more beneficial context. So that's also, we argue, part of the story.
Yeah. So political opportunity structures, they matter sometimes. How they do so is quite a complex affair. What exact elements of a political context should be taken into account is up for discussion, and whether we should look at them at all in every instance is sometimes also not entirely clear. So we hope that with the chapter and with this discussion about the chapter, we've been able to give a good introduction in this, again, this one tool out of the bigger toolkit of social movement scholars. And we hope that with making the three arguments that we make in the chapter about input structure and output structures, about narratives, and about the relative importance of political opportunity structure across particular instances, that we give the reader and the listener a good starting point to try and use that tool in their own research.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening, and thank you for reading.
For those of you watching, be sure to subscribe and follow us at Social Change UQ, and check out our website for more videos.